No, 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 no. What am I seeing? This can't be true.
Think about the last time you felt completely safe, completely certain. The last time you looked at your life and thought, yes, this is real. This is mine. I built this, and nobody can take it from me. Hold that feeling. Now imagine that in a single moment, in the space of one breath, every single piece of that certainty, your marriage, your family, your history, your identity, everything you thought you knew about where you came from and who you belonged to, collapsed. Not gradually, not with warning, all at once, on a Tuesday night, in a kitchen in the American Midwest, because a child needed to do a school project. That is where this story begins. And I need you to stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is one of the most extraordinary and devastating things a human being can discover about their own life. And it happened to a real woman. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand why the last revelation, the one nobody in this family saw coming, is the one that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Sarah. And at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October of 2021, Sarah Mitchell opened an email on her laptop that told her the man she had been married to for 11 years, the man she shared a bed with, the man she had raised children with, the man she loved with everything she had, was her biological brother. Not a distant relation, not a third cousin through some obscure ancestral branch. Her full biological brother. Same mother, same father, the same blood. And when she called her mother that night, shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone, her mother did not say, "What do you mean?" Her mother did not say, "That cannot be right." Her mother said, and I want you to hold these words very carefully, because they are the words of a woman who had been waiting for this phone call for over a decade. Her mother said, "Those tests are not always accurate, sweetheart." She did not ask which test. She already knew. She had always known. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would absolutely love to hear from you. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because we have more stories coming that you are not going to want to miss. Now, before I take you into the full story, I want you to understand the true scale of what we are dealing with here, because the easy version of this story is a headline. Woman marries biological brother. Mother knew. And that headline is technically accurate, but it is the kind of accuracy that strips away everything that matters. All the texture and the grief and the human weight that makes this story worth far more than 30 seconds of shock. The real story is about decisions. About the specific, concrete, human decisions that were made over a period of nearly 35 years that put two people in the same city, the same social world, the same apartment, the same bed, without either of them having any reason to ask the question that would have changed everything. It is a story about a woman named Diane who made a choice in 1987 that she believed she would never have to pay for, and about two people who paid for it anyway, completely without their knowledge or consent, for the better part of their adult lives. So as I walk you through this, I want you to hold 3 questions. The first is the one that everyone asks immediately. How does something like this actually happen in a modern country with records and systems and documentation, where two people who share the same parents can grow up in adjacent geographies, find each other as adults, fall in love, build a life, and never once have any alarm go off? The second question is the one that keeps people awake at night. How does a mother watch it happen and say nothing? Not for a day, not for a week, but for years and years, through the dating and the engagement and the wedding and the children. How does a woman sit through all of that and keep her mouth closed? And the third question is the one I am not going to answer for you right now, because it deserves to be earned. All I will tell you is that it involves something a former social worker said on a phone call that restructured every single thing Diane had told her daughter about why she stayed silent. Every single thing. Let us start at the very beginning. Sarah Mitchell grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is one of those American cities that does not ask for your admiration, but earns it anyway. It is a city built around manufacturing and work and the deep, particular dignity of people who make things with their hands and do not talk about it much afterward. It is a place where people go to the same church their parents went to, where neighborhood blocks carry a sense of accumulated history that is both comforting and, occasionally, suffocating. Sarah fit Dayton in some ways and not in others. She was bright and curious and a little restless in a town that was better at staying put than at moving forward. She played soccer in middle school and gave it up in high school for theater, which her mother Diane thought was impractical and which Sarah would later describe as the first real decision she ever made entirely for herself. She graduated from high school in 2004, got a degree in communications from Ohio State, and moved to Columbus in 2005 at 22 years old, the way young people from Dayton move to Columbus, with a sense of relief that is slightly guilty and a determination to prove that the distance was worth it. What people who knew Sarah growing up consistently say about her is not that she was exceptional in any obvious way, but that she was solid, present, the kind of person you called when something actually mattered, because she would answer, she would stay on the line, and she would not make it about herself. She had a small, tight circle of friends and a habit of loyalty that sometimes cost her more than it should have. She was close to her father Thomas, a mechanical engineer with a quiet sense of humor and an unshakable belief that the most important thing a parent could give their child was consistent presence. She was less close to her mother. That is an important detail, and I do not want to move past it too quickly, because the distance between Sarah and Diane was not the kind of emotional distance that most families have, the normal friction of two strong personalities under the same roof. It was something quieter and stranger than that. It was the distance of a woman who loved her daughter but kept some essential part of herself permanently behind glass, permanently unreachable, in a way that Sarah had sensed her whole life without ever being able to name. She thought it was just how her mother was built. She thought some people were simply constituted that way, loving but unavailable, warm at the surface and sealed beneath it. She grew up pressing her face against that glass and never being able to see through it. She did not know that what was on the other side was not a personality trait. It was a secret that had been sealed in there for 20 years by the time Sarah left for college, and that had been pressing against the glass ever since, looking for a way out. Sarah went to Ohio State, graduated in 2005, moved to Columbus, built herself a quiet, steady adult life, and told herself the emotional distance from her mother was simply the nature of who Diane was. She was wrong about that too. But it would take a long time before she understood how wrong. Marcus Webb grew up 90 miles southwest of Dayton, in Cincinnati, which is close enough that he and Sarah might have passed each other at a rest stop on Interstate 75 without either of them knowing it. But the distance between their childhoods was not measured in miles. It was measured in something harder to map. Sarah grew up knowing exactly where she came from, the names of her grandparents, the town her mother was born in, the photograph on the mantle, and the story behind it. Marcus grew up knowing almost nothing about his origins. He was placed into the Ohio foster care system as an infant in November of 1987. He spent the first 3.5 years of his life in a foster home in Hamilton County before being adopted at age 4 by a couple named James and Patricia Webb, who were, by every account of people who knew them, genuinely good people. Church-going, stable, patient, the kind of adoptive parents the system produces rarely enough that when it happens it feels like grace. James worked in insurance. Patricia taught second grade. They lived in a brick house in a Cincinnati suburb with a backyard big enough for a tire swing, and they loved Marcus in the uncomplicated, unconditional way that asks nothing in return except presence. He was lucky. By the brutal mathematics of the foster care system, Marcus Webb was one of the lucky ones. He had a home, a family, a childhood worth having. And yet, there is a particular kind of knowing that adopted children carry that is nearly impossible to describe to someone who has never felt it. It is not sadness, exactly. It is more like a gap, a place in the story where the first chapter should be and is not. Marcus had a life. He had a good life. But he also had the awareness, present since he was old enough to understand what adoption meant, that his life began in the middle, and that whatever came before the Webbs was a blank he might never fill in. He dealt with this the way he dealt with most things, by building forward. He was an exceptional student, graduated from the University of Cincinnati in 2007 with a degree in business, and moved to Columbus in the summer of 2008 to take a job in software sales. He was 20 years old, new to the city, knew almost nobody, and had just lost his adoptive mother Patricia to cancer the previous year, which had quietly removed the person who had been the emotional center of his family. His adoptive father James retreated into his grief in the way that some men do, pulling inward and far away, and the relationship between them grew formal with distance in the way that some relationships do when the person who held them together is gone. Marcus was, in ways he probably did not fully articulate even to himself, alone in a particular way. Not unhappy, not broken, just carrying the accumulated weight of a life that had started without a context and had never quite found one. And then, in December of 2008, he went to a holiday party thrown by a friend of a friend in a condo in the short north neighborhood of Columbus, and he saw a woman standing by a window with a glass of wine, and something in him recognized her before his mind had any reason to. He would tell a close friend the next morning that she reminded him of someone, but he could not figure out who. She would say the same thing, years later, when she thought back to that first night. Neither of them looked for an explanation. They just moved toward each other the way people move toward things that feel familiar, which is to say, without thinking about it much at all. Sarah and Marcus dated for a year before moving in together. They were the kind of couple that made their friends feel a quiet, involuntary envy, not because they were showy about their love, but because they were genuinely easy together, in the way that is actually rare, in the way that most couples have to work toward and some never reach. They understood each other quickly and completely, with a shared instinct for when to press and when to leave alone, a shared rhythm that both of them attributed to compatibility and neither of them thought to question. Their friends described them as inevitable. Marcus proposed on a Thursday night in 2010 in their kitchen, without a ring, because he had forgotten to buy one, and Sarah said yes before he finished asking. And the story of the forgotten ring became the kind of story couples tell at dinner parties for years because it is exactly right, exactly them. They married in September of 2011 in a small ceremony outside Columbus. Their daughter Emma was born in 2012. Their son Tyler came in 2015. They bought a house in a suburb of Columbus, a 4-bedroom colonial with a yard where Marcus planted a garden every spring with more ambition than expertise, and the running joke about the failed garden became one of those private codes that functions as shorthand for an entire relationship. The shorthand for something neither of them needed to say out loud because they both already knew it. They built a life. A real, textured, imperfect, genuine life. There was one thing that Sarah had always noticed about Marcus and had never been able to explain. Not a warning sign, not a discomfort, just a quiet, persistent feeling, present since the night they met, that looking at his face was somehow like looking at something familiar rather than something new. She mentioned it to him once, years into their marriage, and he laughed and said maybe they had met in a past life, and she laughed too, and neither of them thought about it again. She would think about it later. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night in a kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, she would finally understand exactly what that feeling had been, and it would not comfort her at all. To understand how Sarah and Marcus ended up in the same life, you need to understand what Diane was carrying. And to understand what Diane was carrying, you need to go back to Cincinnati in 1986, to a young woman who was 21 years old, living alone in a small apartment, working a clerical job at an insurance office, and doing everything she could to hold herself together. Diane had grown up in a conservative, deeply religious household where the management of appearances was treated as a moral obligation. Her father was a deacon. Her mother taught Sunday school. The family operated on the understanding that what happened inside a home stayed inside a home, and that a woman's reputation was both her most valuable possession and her most fragile one. Diane had absorbed all of this completely. It had become the operating system she ran on. And in 1986, that operating system was about to be tested in a way she was not prepared for. She met a man named Robert Calloway at a bar in downtown Cincinnati. Robert was 24, worked in construction, and had the particular magnetism of men who fill up every room they walk into, loud, physical, certain of themselves in a way that reads as confidence until it becomes something else entirely. Within 2 months, they were inseparable. Within 6 months, Diane had quietly reduced her circle of friends, found reasons not to visit her family, and rearranged her life around a man who had opinions about where she went and who she spent her time with. She did not register these changes as warning signs at first. She registered them as love. The early mechanics of control often present that way, as intensity, as devotion, as the flattering attention of someone who wants to know everything about you. It is only later, when the circle has drawn tight enough that you can feel it pressing, that you understand what it actually was. By 1987, Diane was 22 years old and frightened, not by any single dramatic event, but by the accumulated weight of a relationship that had slowly and methodically carved away the parts of her that existed independently of Robert. She did not leave. Leaving requires a self that is intact enough to make the decision, and Diane's was not. And then, in the spring of 1987, she discovered she was pregnant. What is documented in the records that Sarah and her genealogist would later obtain is this. In November of 1987, a male infant was born in Hamilton County, Ohio. The mother was listed as anonymous. The infant was placed with Hamilton County Children's Services within 72 hours of his birth. His name, given to him years later by the couple who adopted him, would be Marcus Webb. Diane had given birth to a son and surrendered him before he had drawn a full day of breaths in the world outside her body, and she had done it in complete silence, without telling a single person on earth that it had happened. She had chosen to deliver at a hospital she did not normally use, in a part of the county where she was unknown, specifically so that the entire event would be invisible. The pregnancy, the delivery, the surrender, all of it contained, all of it sealed behind the glass that Diane kept between herself and the world. And then she went home, and 4 months later, she was pregnant again. And this time, the child was a girl. And Diane kept her. She named her Sarah. She told herself the first child was gone forever, placed into a system that would carry him far away and close the door behind him. She was wrong about all of it, but it would take 34 years for the wrongness to find her. Diane moved back to the Dayton area when Sarah was 8 months old. She built a new life with the methodical, quiet determination of a woman who has decided that the past is a country she will never return to. She met Thomas Mitchell in 1990. They married in 1993. Thomas adopted Sarah and raised her as his own with the uncomplicated, patient love of a man who understood that fatherhood was a choice, not a biology. For 22 years, the secret held. Nobody asked. Nobody looked. Marcus grew up as Marcus Webb in Cincinnati, not knowing his biological family existed. Sarah grew up as Sarah Mitchell in Dayton, not knowing she had a brother. And Diane stood between both of those facts, knowing both of them, and said nothing. Not once. Not to anyone. For 22 years, she said nothing. And then Sarah brought a man named Marcus Webb home for Thanksgiving, and the 22 years ended in a moment in a kitchen doorway. It was the fall of 2009. Sarah and Marcus had been together for about a year. Bringing him home was the natural next step, the ordinary, happy domestic ritual of a couple becoming serious. Sarah was excited. Thomas had texted that he was looking forward to meeting him. Diane had asked on the phone whether Marcus had any dietary restrictions. It was all completely normal, right up to the moment Marcus walked through the front door. People who were at that Thanksgiving dinner remember Diane being unusually quiet throughout the afternoon. One cousin has said she left the table twice during dinner. Another described her as physically present, but mentally somewhere very far away. Everyone assumed she was tired or coming down with something. Nobody thought to look for another explanation. But what was happening behind Diane's carefully arranged face at that table was this. The moment Marcus Webb walked through her door, she recognized him. Not with the clean certainty of someone looking at a photograph. With the deep, cellular, animal recognition of a mother who had held her child for 2 hours 22 years ago before surrendering him to strangers. She recognized the shape of his face. She recognized something in his eyes that she had not seen since 1987 and had believed she had successfully buried. She recognized her son, and she sat down at the Thanksgiving table, and she passed the rolls, and she smiled in all the right places, and she excused herself twice, and she stood in the kitchen alone both times with her hands flat on the counter, and she made the decision she had been making since November of 1987. She decided to say nothing. She told herself she was not certain enough. She told herself the mind projects guilt onto strangers, and that the resemblance was generic, and that the probability of her surrendered son ending up in her daughter's social circle in a different city was too small to act on. She decided that 60% certainty was not enough. She went back out to the table and poured more wine and asked Marcus about his work. 2 years later, she stood in the front row at their wedding in a white hat with blue trim and watched her daughter make vows to her own brother. And she said nothing. By the fall of 2021, Sarah and Marcus had been married for a decade. The life they had built together had the particular quality of something that has been tested and held. not without the ordinary accumulation of friction and disappointment that every long marriage carries, but solid in the way that things are solid when they have been genuinely earned. Marcus had found work he cared about in the technology sector. Sarah freelanced from home, which gave her the flexibility she had needed when Emma was born in 2012 and which she had never gone back from. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in a Columbus suburb. The garden jokes continued. They were a family, in all the imperfect and irreplaceable ways that word means. And then Emma came home from school with a homework assignment. She was 8 years old, and her 3rd grade class was doing a unit on family heritage. The teacher had mentioned consumer DNA testing as one way families were exploring their backgrounds. Emma had seen the commercials on television and had been asking about them for months. So one evening in September of 2021, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework, she looked up at her mother and asked if they could please order one of the kits. Sarah ordered it that same week. She mentioned it to Marcus, who smiled and said he was not interested in taking one himself. She understood without him having to explain why. For a man who had spent his whole life without a clear origin story, a DNA test was less a casual adventure and more a door that might open onto something he was not ready to look at. She did not push him. She ordered one kit, completed it herself, mailed it, and went back to her life. 6 weeks passed. She forgot about it almost entirely. And then on a Tuesday night in late October, while she was alone in the kitchen finishing a freelance project after the children had gone to bed, her phone buzzed with a notification. Your Ancestry DNA results are ready. She clicked it without any particular feeling. She was mildly curious, the way you are curious about something you ordered a month ago and have not thought about since. She opened her laptop. She clicked the download. And the world she had been sitting in quietly and contentedly for 33 years ended in the blue light of that screen at 11:47 at night. The notification did not hedge. It did not equivocate. It did not offer the kind of qualified, probabilistic language that might have given her room to breathe. Close family match detected. Predicted relationship, sibling or half-sibling. Shared DNA, 47.3%. And beneath that, a name. A name Sarah knew better than almost any name in the world. Because it was her husband's name. She stared at it. She closed the app. She opened it again. The name was still there. She closed the laptop. She stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the dark backyard where the last of Marcus's failed garden was still visible. She sat back down. She opened the laptop again. She opened Google and typed DNA test error rate, and she read for 90 minutes looking for an exit. She did not find one. The scientific literature was unambiguous. At 47% shared DNA, the probability of a laboratory error is so remote as to be functionally non-existent. You do not share nearly half your genetic material with a stranger through error. You share it with a sibling, with a parent, with a child. She had found her husband's name. She had found 47%. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she picked up her phone and called her mother. Diane answered on the second ring. It was past 2 in the morning, and she answered on the second ring with a voice that was awake and measured and calm, not the voice of someone pulled from deep sleep. Sarah would register that detail later, when the numbness wore off and her mind began the forensic work of reconstructing what she now understood in a completely different light. She said, "Mom, I need to ask you something." She asked whether there was anything about their family that Diane had never told her. Anything about their history, their background, anything at all. Diane paused. A pause that Sarah would later describe as approximately 3 seconds, and which Diane would later claim was barely 1, and which was almost certainly whatever length a pause needs to be for a woman to calculate how much she can continue to conceal. And then Diane said, "Those tests are not always accurate, sweetheart." She had not been told which test. She had not been told there was a test. Sarah had asked a general question about their family history, and Diane had immediately, without any prompt, referenced a DNA test. Because she already knew. She had already calculated what a call like this, from her daughter, at 2 in the morning, after 34 years of silence, almost certainly meant. Sarah felt the room tilt. She told her mother what she had found. She said the name. She said the number. 47%. She said the word the website had used, sibling, quietly, without drama, in case the drama of saying it too loudly was what made it real. And Diane said, "Those companies are not as regulated as people think." And Sarah said, "Mom, is there something I don't know?" And Diane said, very quietly, I think you should get some rest, Sarah, and we can talk about this properly in the morning. And Sarah said, Mom. And there was a silence. And Diane said, I'm sure there is an explanation. Good night, sweetheart. And she hung up. Sarah sat with the phone in her hand for a very long time after the line went dead. She did not cry. She did not panic. She felt, instead, a terrible and clarifying stillness. The stillness of someone who has spent years noticing a locked door and has just, unexpectedly, and without warning, been handed the key. Her mother had known immediately what test she was referring to. Her mother had not asked what she meant. Her mother had gone directly and without hesitation to the explanation that tests are unreliable, which meant she had been waiting, for some length of time that Sarah did not yet know, for a phone call exactly like this one, which meant the test was not wrong. Sarah did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table and watched the house go from dark to gray to bright as morning came in. She made pancakes and poured orange juice and found Tyler's shoe and drove Emma to school and came home and sat back down in the empty house. And then she opened her laptop and ordered 2 more DNA kits from 2 different companies. She needed to be sure. She needed, more than anything in the world, to be wrong. Sarah did not tell Marcus what she had found. She made the deliberate, considered decision to wait until she had more information. And I want to pause here and ask you to be generous with that decision rather than impatient with it. Because the question of how you tell the person you have built your life with for 11 years that you may be their biological sister is not a question with a comfortable answer. There is no script for that conversation. There is no gentle version. So she waited, and she built the foundation she would need before the conversation that would change everything could happen. She ordered the 2 additional tests under a secondary email address and had them delivered to a friend's address, and completed them with the methodical composure of a person who has moved past hoping she is wrong and into needing to know exactly how wrong she is not. 3 weeks passed. The second test came back first, from a different company. Shared DNA, 46.8%. Predicted relationship, full sibling. The third arrived 4 days later. 47.1%. Full sibling. 3 tests. 3 independent laboratories. 3 separate analyses of the same genetic reality, each arriving at the same conclusion with a precision that removed any remaining possibility of error. Sarah laid all 3 printouts on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. Then she got up, poured a glass of water, sat back down, and opened her laptop to find a professional genetic genealogist. Her name was Carol Hensley. She operated out of Indianapolis and had spent 11 years specializing in what the field calls NP cases, not parent expected, the clinical term that covers every discovery a DNA test can produce when your biological parentage turns out to be something other than what you were told. Carol had seen fertility fraud, hidden adoptions, children whose existence had been denied for decades. She was, by the accounts of people who had worked with her, the kind of professional whose composure in the face of the unbearable comes not from detachment, but from genuine, practiced compassion for what the unbearable actually costs a human being. Sarah emailed her on a Wednesday evening. Carol responded within the hour. 2 weeks later, Carol delivered her findings in a video call that Sarah took sitting in her car in the driveway of her own house, with the engine off and the windows fogging in the November cold, because she did not want the children to hear. Carol had built the family tree from both ends, from Sarah's known history on one side, and from the extended DNA matches associated with Marcus's profile on the other. What she found was not ambiguous. The 2 trees, despite 34 years of separation, connected at a single point. A man named Robert Calloway, born in Cincinnati in 1963, who appeared as a DNA match in both Sarah's and Marcus's extended family results. They did not share only a father. They shared a mother. The placement records Carol had cross-referenced, Ohio adoption records from Hamilton County dated November 1987, matched the timeline precisely. Marcus Webb, born in Cincinnati in November 1987, biological mother anonymous, biological father Robert Calloway, was the full biological brother of Sarah Mitchell, born in April 1988, mother Diane, father Robert Calloway. When Carol finished presenting this, Sarah thanked her. Very quietly and very formally. She ended the call, and she sat in the fogged-up car in her own driveway for an hour and 40 minutes, watching the rain run down the windshield, thinking about the feeling she had always had about Marcus, that quiet, persistent, impossible-to-name sense of familiarity that had been with her since the night they met. And for the first time in 11 years, she understood exactly what it had been. Her body had always known. She had just never had any reason to listen to it. Sarah chose a Wednesday morning in January of 2022 to tell Marcus. She chose the coffee shop on Fifth Avenue where he stopped every morning on his way to work, the one where he knew the barista by name and always ordered the same thing, and sometimes sat at the corner table for 15 minutes before heading in because he liked the quiet transition between home and the day. She was already there when he arrived. His coffee was waiting. He saw her face when he walked through the door and stopped for just a moment, not dramatically, just the small, involuntary pause of a body registering a signal before the conscious mind has processed it. He sat down across from her. He said, "What's wrong?" And she slid an envelope across the table. Inside were the printouts from all 3 DNA tests and a one-page summary that Carol Hensley had prepared, with the conclusion written clearly at the top. Full biological siblings. Same mother. Same father. Marcus read the documents without speaking. He read them slowly, the way a person reads something they are hoping will mean something different the second time through. Sarah watched his face do the thing that faces do when a person is processing something that has no existing category in their experience, something the mind genuinely has no folder for. He looked up from the papers. He said, "How long have you known?" Not as an accusation. Just precisely. He wanted the exact shape of it. She told him everything. The first test, the phone call with her mother, the 2 additional tests, Carol Hensley, the paper trail, the hour and 40 minutes in the car in the rain. He listened without interrupting, which was so entirely and characteristically Marcus, so utterly like him, that it broke her heart in a specific way, the way it breaks when someone is being completely themselves at the worst possible moment. When she finished, he looked back down at the papers for a long time. Then, very quietly, he said, "She knew." Not a question. A statement, clean and certain. He was talking about Diane. And Sarah said, yes, she knew. And neither of them said anything for a long time after that. And then Marcus said, "We need to go to Dayton." They drove to Dayton on a Saturday in February. Together, in the same car, which had been Marcus's idea, and which Sarah had initially resisted before understanding that he had as much right to be in that room as anyone. Possibly more, because he was the one who had been given away. He was the one whose first chapter had been edited out of the record by a woman who had decided, before he was a week old, that his existence was inconvenient to acknowledge. Sarah had confirmed beforehand that Thomas would be away for the weekend. She needed the conversation to happen before Thomas knew, before anyone else knew, before the story spread beyond the people who were already inside it. They parked in front of the house and sat in the car for 20 minutes. Marcus looked at the house through the windshield. He had been inside it dozens of times, watched football in the living room, helped Thomas build a deck in the backyard in the summer of 2014, eaten Thanksgiving dinner at that dining room table 4 times. He said quietly, looking at the front door, "I should have felt it." Not as accusation, as grief. The grief of a man confronting the fact that the gap in his story had a specific shape, and the shape was this house on this street, and the woman inside it who had looked at his face 11 years ago and recognized him and said nothing. Sarah said, "You couldn't have known." He said, "I know, but I should have felt it." And she said, very quietly, "I think we both did." And they got out of the car. Diane opened the door before they knocked. She had been watching from the window. She was composed in the particular way of a woman who has spent 34 years preparing for a moment and has thought about it so often that when it finally arrives, the shock has been worn smooth. She opened the door and looked at the 2 of them standing side by side on the porch in the February cold, and her face did something complicated and then went very still. And she said, "I wondered when this day would come." Not what a surprise. Not is everything all right. She said she had wondered when this day would come, and she stepped back from the door, and she let them in. They sat in the living room, the same living room where Sarah had grown up, where family photographs covered the walls, and where a framed photograph of Sarah and Marcus on their wedding day. Marcus laughing, Sarah looking at him with the expression of someone who cannot believe their luck, sat on the end table by the couch. Diane had kept that photograph there for 11 years. She sat down across from them and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her daughter, and then at the son she had surrendered 34 years ago who was sitting in her living room for the first time. And she began to talk. She talked for nearly 3 hours. Sarah would later say that sitting in that room and listening was unlike anything she had ever been through, because the account Diane gave was both the most devastating and, in some terrible way, the most coherent thing she had ever heard. Once you had all the pieces, it made sense. Not morally, not in any way that justified what had been done, but as a sequence of choices made by a frightened person in circumstances that went some distance toward explaining her, even when they could not excuse her. Diane described Robert Calloway. She described the relationship and the particular slow geometry of fear and control inside it. She described the pregnancy in 1987 and the decision, made alone, in the specific and unwitnessed panic of a woman who had no one to call and no options that felt safe, to surrender the child. She said she had chosen the hospital she did specifically so the delivery would leave no trace in her known world. She said the placement had happened within 48 hours. She said she had held the baby for approximately 2 hours before a nurse came to take him, and that in those 2 hours she had looked at his face and memorized it with the desperate attention of someone who understands they are seeing something for the very last time. She said she had told herself, for 34 years, that giving him up was an act of love. She said she was still not entirely sure she believed it. She described the second pregnancy. She described the decision to keep Sarah. She described 22 years of quiet. And then she described the Thanksgiving of 2009 with a specificity that made clear she had been through that day in her memory many, many times over the years. She said she had recognized Marcus the moment she saw him. Not fully, not with the certainty that removes all doubt, but with enough of a recognition that it had sat in her chest for the rest of that day like something she could not digest. She said she had spent the weeks after Thanksgiving talking herself out of it, telling herself the resemblance was generic and she was projecting guilt onto a stranger's face. She said she had reached 60% certainty and decided that 60% was not enough to act on. And then Sarah had called to say they were engaged, and the certainty had risen to something much higher. And Diane had made the decision again. She had decided that what she could not prove with absolute certainty did not require her to speak. She looked at her daughter and the son she had surrendered 34 years ago, and she said, "I am so sorry. I am so sorry." And she put her face in her hands, and she wept. Sarah and Marcus sat across from her, and neither of them moved to comfort her. They let the silence do what it needed to do. They sat in the room full of family photographs, and they let Diane carry what she had brought into that room entirely on her own. And then Sarah said, very quietly and very precisely, "Mom, when did you know it was him? Not when did you suspect. When did you know?" And Diane looked up from her hands. And she said, "The Thanksgiving. I knew at the Thanksgiving." And Sarah said, "And you came to the wedding anyway." And Diane did not answer. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. There was only the silence of a woman who had made a decision that she had been paying for ever since, sitting across from the full cost of it at last. If the story had ended there, in that living room in Dayton in February, it would have been devastating enough. A mother who surrendered a child in fear, recognized him across a dinner table 2 decades later, and chose, over and over again, to say nothing. That would have been more than enough. But the story did not end there. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Sarah received a phone call from a woman she did not know. The woman identified herself as a former family services worker who had handled infant placements in Hamilton County in the late 1980s. She said she had come across information about Sarah's situation through a contact in the genealogical research community. She said she remembered the placement. She said she remembered Diane. And then she said something that restructured everything Diane had told them in that living room. According to this woman, whose account was subsequently corroborated by a review of Ohio placement records that Carol Hensley conducted over the following weeks, the adoption in 1987 had not been a fully sealed, fully anonymous closed adoption that cut all informational threads on both sides. It had been what was known in the Ohio system at that time as a semi-open placement. A placement in which the biological mother was not given the identity of the adoptive family, but was provided with general information about the region in which the child would be placed and would likely remain. The semi-open placement documentation, signed by Diane in November of 1987, specified that the infant had been placed with a family within the Southwestern Ohio Regional Network, which covered Hamilton, Butler, Warren, and the adjacent counties. The same regional network that, by virtue of its geographic scope, encompassed the communities in which Sarah would grow up, attend school, build friendships, and eventually move through as a young adult. Diane had not simply stumbled into a coincidence at Thanksgiving in 2009. Diane had signed a document in 1987 that told her, in general terms, where her son was. Not his name, not his address, not his family, but the region. She had known, for 22 years, that her son was somewhere in the same world her daughter was growing up in. She had chosen, for 22 years, not to look. And then she had watched her daughter fall in love with a man from that region, a man of exactly the right age, a man with features she had recognized across a dinner table, and she had decided that the recognition was insufficient to act on. The story Diane told in that living room was the story of a woman operating in the dark, a woman whose silence was born of uncertainty. But she had not been operating in the dark. She had had a light in her hand the entire time. She had made a choice about whether to use it. And the name of that choice was not uncertainty. It was something else that each person who hears this story will have to name for themselves. Sarah and Marcus separated in the spring of 2022. The separation was not angry. There was no villain between them. There was no betrayal between them. What there was, instead, was the slow and honest work of grieving something that could not be preserved. A marriage that had been real and good and built with genuine love, and that the world does not permit, regardless of how solid it felt from the inside. Marcus has spoken, in limited terms, to people close to him about what the experience has been like, and the word that appears most consistently in those accounts is grief. Pure, structureless grief without a cultural script for how to carry it, without a language that exists for what he lost and found in the same moment. He lost a wife. He found a sister. He lost the life he had built. He discovered, for the first time in his life, that his story had not begun in chapter 3, that there was a first chapter, that it had been growing up 90 miles away in a brick house on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio, the whole time. Their children, Emma and Tyler, are being raised by two parents who have maintained, by all accounts, a relationship organized entirely around what is best for them. The medical dimensions of their children's birth circumstances are being managed privately, with appropriate professional support, and with the dignity that two children who did absolutely nothing wrong deserve entirely. Thomas Mitchell found out the full story in March of 2022. His response was quiet. Thomas had always been quiet. He had been loyal and present for nearly 30 years without knowing any of it. And when he learned the truth, he directed everything he had outward, toward his daughter, toward what she needed, without asking her to manage his grief alongside her own. He just showed up, the way he had always shown up. Sarah has said that her father's steadiness through all of it was the thing that held her together when nothing else would. The man with no biological connection to any part of this story was the one who was most completely present in it. Thomas and Diane separated in the summer of 2022 and filed for divorce by the end of the year. Diane lives alone now in a smaller house outside Dayton. She and Sarah have not spoken since the confrontation in February of 2022. Marcus, to the knowledge of anyone involved in this story, has had no contact with her. Diane did not face criminal prosecution. Legal experts who reviewed the circumstances were consistent in their conclusion. There is no provision in Ohio law, or in the law of most American jurisdictions, that criminalizes the failure to disclose the existence of a child placed for adoption, even when that failure results in harm of this magnitude. What Diane did was, in the technical language of the law, not actionable. In the language of everything else, it is something each person who hears this story will have to assess for themselves. There is a version of this story where you feel some sympathy for Diane, and I will not tell you that the sympathy is entirely misplaced, because her circumstances in 1987 were genuinely difficult, and the fear she was operating under was real, and the world she grew up in had given her very few tools for what she was dealing with. But the sympathy, if you feel it, must sit beside something else. Because the decision Diane made in 1987 is one thing. The decisions she made in the 22 years that followed, and at the Thanksgiving table in 2009, and on the phone at 2 in the morning in October of 2021, were not made by a 22-year-old girl in a bad situation. They were made by a woman with full agency and full knowledge and every opportunity to speak, who chose, over and over and over again, not to. And the person who paid for those choices was not Diane. This story is, on its face, extraordinary. The specific combination of circumstances that produced it, the geography, the semi-open placement, the DNA test ordered for a school project, is not one most people will encounter. But it lives inside a question that is not extraordinary at all. A question that every family carries in some form, in some size, in some version. What do we owe the people we love? The truth, even when the truth is unbearable. Or the version of the truth that protects them, or that we tell ourselves protects them, from what we have decided they cannot handle. Diane would tell you, if she were here, that she made her choices out of love, that she was protecting her daughter, that she was protecting a life that was already built and working in good. And the thing that makes this story genuinely hard to dismiss cleanly is that she was not entirely lying. There was love in it. There was genuine, if badly distorted, love in it. She did not want Sarah to be hurt. She wanted the secret to stay buried and for everyone to go on being fine. The problem is that you cannot want something enough to make it true. You cannot decide a secret is contained simply by deciding not to speak it out loud. Secrets do not obey that logic. They have their own momentum, their own relentless tendency toward the surface. And the DNA revolution has made that tendency essentially unstoppable. More than 40 million people have now taken consumer genetic tests. Tens of thousands of them have found things they were not looking for: hidden adoptions, unknown siblings, families separated by choice or by circumstance, children who were never supposed to find each other, finding each other anyway. Because the mathematics of DNA is patient and precise and does not care about the decisions people made in 1987 to keep their secrets safe. The technology has not changed human behavior. It has changed the odds of human secrets surviving human behavior. Diane's secret survived for 34 years. And then a child had a school project. And a mother ordered a kit. And the secret died on a Tuesday night at 11:47 in a kitchen in Columbus, Ohio. Some truths wait. They do not rush. They wait in databases and in the specific angle of a face across a Thanksgiving dinner table that you recognize before you have any reason to. They wait with extraordinary patience for you to stop looking away. I have been sitting with this story for a long time. And the question I keep returning to is this: at what point does protecting someone become a way of controlling them? At what point does a secret that began as an act of fear become, through decades of choices, an act of ownership over another person's life? Sarah never had a chance to choose. Not once. From the moment Diane walked out of that hospital in November of 1987, Sarah's life was already being shaped by a truth she was never permitted to know. Her marriage, her family, her sense of herself, and where she came from. All of it built on a foundation that had a crack in it before she poured the first concrete. She did not get to know. She did not get to decide. Someone decided for her, decided what she could handle and what she deserved to be told about her own life, and made that decision repeatedly and consistently in the direction of their own protection, dressed up in the language of love. Think about the quieter version of this that exists in families everywhere. The thing that is not being said. The secret being maintained on someone else's behalf by someone who has appointed themselves the judge of what that person can handle, without asking, is that love? Or is it something else wearing love's clothes? I want to know what you think. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Was Diane protecting her family? Or was she protecting herself? And what would you have done, sitting in her place at that Thanksgiving table in 2009, with the recognition rising in you and the gravy boat in your hand, and your daughter laughing across the table with the man you recognized as your son? Would you have found the words? Would you have found the courage? Or would you have poured the wine and passed the rolls and told yourself that 60% was not enough? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the actual questions this story leaves us with. And they deserve to be sat with honestly, without comfortable answers, because the version of Diane that chose herself over her daughter is not as foreign to us as we would like to believe. All of us have things we have not said. All of us have doors we have kept closed because opening them felt too costly. The only question is what is behind those doors, and whether what is behind them is patient enough to find its own way out. If this story moved you, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Hit the like button, and subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, so you are notified the moment our next story goes up. These stories matter because the people in them are real, and because the questions they carry belong to all of us.